Well, here we go. Part 4, Traced Human DNA's Big Surprise, with Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. He's one of our research scientists here at Answers in Genesis, as a PhD in biology from Harvard University. He studied a lot of genetics. He loves history, bringing biblical history together with study of genetics, particularly the Y chromosome. Fascinating insights in regard to people of the world and tracing them back to the sons of Noah, various events in history. The biblical history makes sense of what we find in the science of genetics. You know, Dr. Jeanson, in this particular program, you're going to talk about some so-called shocking discoveries. You know, it's interesting. Right now in our culture, there's this big emphasis in the secular world on critical race theory, and even some churches have, adopted critical race theory. But the emphasis of critical race theory, well, first of all, its foundation is not on the Bible and the Bible's history. Its foundation is man's beliefs about things. And not only that, its emphasis is judging people according to their outside. Now, you're going to show in this particular session the outside doesn't tell you really about your history and who you are and where you came from. And actually, what's important is to look at the inside. Now, from a spiritual perspective, it's important to look at the inside in regard to our heart and mind and what we believe and so on. But in genetics, it's important to look at genetics, or you'll misunderstand the outside. So I'm going to turn over to you, and you give us some fascinating insights and tell us about some of these shocking discoveries.
Yes, and just for way of re-emphasis, what I'm about to show is results, cutting-edge scientific results based on male inherited DNA, the Y chromosome. It changes. There's about 3 DNA mistakes that happen per generation. So you can literally count off generations in your DNA. You can compare it to people around the globe and come up with this gigantic family tree. And it shows history. This is something that should be true if the time scale recorded in Scripture is true. This is something I put in print in October 2017. And it's not something special for me. Really, anyone could come up with this prediction. You look at the Bible, it records everything collapses pre-flood. It's destroyed by God and judgment, restarts with Noah and his family. And so therefore, the history of civilization is 4,500 years old. It's all post-flood, and it should be all over our DNA. And that's basically what I say in this book. And that's what this new book, Traced, shows chapter after chapter, and even ends with this remarkable discovery at the very beginning of the tree. We can see Noah, his 3 sons. We can see the genealogy of Genesis 10. We can also, as a result of this, find the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There's a clear echo of that in Genesis 10, a unique branching structure, and can count off the generations down to these great patriarchs of Scripture. We haven't yet found all of them. And the third point here to make, to review, is that you may have in your own DNA the answers to some of the missing tribes of Israel, or ancient cultures like the Sumerians or the Assyrians, or on and on the list goes. You may have in your DNA the answers to some of these narratives we're still looking for. This new research gives us the history of peoples. We're just beginning. We've got tens of thousands of DNA sequences, but this is a far cry from the nearly 4 billion men that live on this planet who have within themselves, within their DNA, the narrative, the answer to this larger question of the history of peoples. Some of what we've seen already is that things we call prehistory, post-Babel, pre-written records. DNA gives us a new tool. Again, it's a tool that requires the 4,500-year time scale to see things we know, like the collapse of the population post-arrival of Columbus. And then we can turn around and find the history pre-Columbus, and we find new events that connect us back to specific events in the old world. And the book also goes through things like pre-colonial Africa, pre-colonial Pacific, other sections of the globe that are in mainstream science called, quote unquote, prehistory. What I want to do now is walk through some of the most remarkable examples of ethnic change, so-called racial change, that's occurred in human history based on this DNA-based tree. And I want to start by going back to Scripture. Again, the explicit statement about our ancestry, and answer a question I still get from time to time. People have asked, well, when Noah and his family left the ark, you have Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the 3 wives of these 3 boys. Could there be any other lineages? Did Noah and his wife have more children? And I would say this verse basically says no, because it says, sons of Noah, Genesis 9, who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. And the whole earth seems to suggest no one else contributed. So it's these three boys, their descendants are listed in Genesis 10. And so therefore, every single ethnicity that we see on earth, every single so-called race, must have come from three couples. Well, how does that work? And what does that imply then about the potential messiness of the history in each one of us? And I want to use an example that I'll return to at the end of this talk, this little mini lecture, that I think illustrates some of these points very well. So if you're watching, I want you to take a close look at these three ladies. Two of them are African. One of them is one of these ladies has heritage from the Pacific, and you might have some good guesses as to who's who. But the bigger question that I want to ask is, which of these ladies had the more recent common ancestor? Or we could ask the question a different way. What is the ethnic and so-called racial history of the people groups to which these ladies belong? So they're ladies, they don't have a Y chromosome, but they belong to people groups for which we have Y chromosome data, and that's what I'm going to explore in a moment. Have the people groups to which these ladies belong always looked the way they look in this screen? Has this lady's people group always had eyes that are shaped kind of like hers? Has the skin tone of this people group always been in between the light skin tone here and the dark skin tone here? What about the other facial features and ethnic features of these ladies? Of course, what we're going to see is that there's more to this than meets the eye. So we're going to pause that for a moment, return to it later, and use a simpler example and get back to the question of how could you have so many differences in the world today arise from just three couples? So here's another image, young man, and I want to ask the same questions of him that I just asked of those three ladies. What is his history? Has his family line always looked like he does? The shape of his nose, the shape of his eyes, his cheekbones, his skin tone, his hair color, his hair type. Has that been a consistent feature? And I can answer the question for you and tell you that he comes from a mixed race, so-called mixed ethnicity family. Mom is Hispanic, dad is dark-skinned, African-American looking. And you can see the son of the two parents has a skin tone not as dark as dad, not as light as mom, but as intermediate. And if we think about this from a basic genetics perspective, I'm going to oversimplify, but it makes the point. If we think about the genetics of skin tone as just two letters, and if you followed Ancestors and Genesis for many years, this should be familiar, but it's worth repeating and reiterating. If we think of skin tone as with basic high school genetics, capital letters, lowercase letters, capital A, capital B, lowercase a, lowercase b. Let's say dad is all uppercase letters, all uppercase A's, uppercase B's. Mom is light skinned, so she's all lowercase letters, lowercase A's, lowercase B's. We would diagram their marriage and their son with this Punnett square. Dad would have dark skin, all capital letters. Mom is all light skin, lowercase letters, so she contributes only light skin DNA, or lowercase letters. Dad is only contributing the information for dark skin, so uppercase letters. And the son is middle brown in skin tone because he has the genetic information, both capital letters and lowercase letters. Now, what happens if that boy grows up and marries? What will his children look like? Well, if he marries a dark-skinned lady who's got all uppercase letters, and he's a mix of uppercase and lowercase, he will have a mix of offspring. Some will be as dark as dad. Some as middle brown as he is. And so let's reflect on that fact for a moment. This boy can grow up and have children that are as dark as dad, and those dark-skinned children can have this light skin for a grandmother. And the reverse is also true. He could grow up and marry a light-skinned lady who might have all lowercase letters, and so he would contribute a mix of DNA information. His wife would contribute all lowercase genetic information, and so some could be middle brown like him, or it could be as light-skinned as that lady, light-skinned as mom. And so in that scenario, this dark-skinned dad could have light-skinned grandchildren. so-called racial change, ethnic change can happen in the generational blink of an eye, very quickly. And if you have those three couples, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives, with genetic information for a variety of ethnic features, you can produce all the diversity that we see today very easily. So have these ladies always looked this way? This tree is what we're going to use to find the answer. This is something we looked at in episode 1, where we could see the various sections of the tree: Ham, Japheth, Shem. All this information you'll find in the book. You can take if you get a Y chromosome test, not just a generic test, but specifically a male DNA Y chromosome test, and find out your haplogroup or result, probably one of these major groupings. You can use one of the tables in the back of the book to look up your history, and I'll show you a place where you can write in if you have questions and ask for help on interpreting the result and finding exactly your history. I want to show you now several examples of shocking history that come from this tree in terms of race and ethnicity, and then return to the question of these three ladies. I'm going to give you just a flavor of some of the crazy stories that emerge from this tree and see if that changes whatever your initial guesses are to the questions I asked earlier. What is the racial or ethnic history of these three ladies and their people groups? Which of them has a closer common ancestor? And have they always looked this way throughout their entire history? So let's just start with a few examples. First one being from this branch called E1B1B. I'm going to show you a map here of its distribution. The size of the circle represents the relative abundance. So in Somalia, close to 80% of the men belong to this branch, E1B1B. So it's got a big circle. You can see up here in Europe, the circles are much smaller, but there are some men in Scandinavia, small circles, maybe 1 to 5%, who belong to E1B1B. So you've got men who probably look like this, living in Scandinavia, belong to this particular branch. What this book shows in walking through the history of these various branches is the origin and fate of each of these sections of the tree. So for this particular branch, I'm just going to tell you it, and I justify it more in the book. And really what I want to draw out for you now is the ethnic implications. So right now, you have men in Scandinavia, pale face like this guy, because he belongs to this branch, E1B1B. That means some of his ancestors were olive-skinned Arabs. E1B1B appears to have been distributed in North Africa and eventually into Europe through the conquests of the Muslim Arabs around the time of Muhammad, and also through the conquests of the Muslim Ottoman Turks, bringing that into Europe. But that's not the whole story. Who did the Arabs themselves arise from on this E1B1B branch? If you look at the deeper history of E1B1B, it connects to many sub-Saharan African branches. And in chapters 5 and 6 of this book, I derive the evidence for putting the origin of E1B1B and of the E group in general in Northwest Africa, and I'd say it's likely connected to Kush, or the ancient Nubians, dark-skinned peoples of Northeast Africa. Nubians were one of the Egyptian dynasties. I think it's the 25th dynasty. So you have people right now in Northern Europe, light-skinned like this, whose ancestry traces to the Middle East, also down here more anciently into modern Sudan, what is now Sudan, and is connected to ancient Egypt. So people like him could in fact be descendants of the ancient Egyptians. Who would have predicted that, looking at his face and ethnic features? But just one example of some of the crazy narratives that emerge from this. I'll give you another example. Back to the tree. This time we're going to look at the branch R1b. We already talked about some of this history in episode 1 and 2. Ken and I both belong to this. It comes from Central Asia. What I didn't talk about is you can see on this map of where R1b exists today, there are sub-Saharan Africans who belong to this branch. It's not shown here because I don't think I had Zambians as part of the populations I looked at in the book, but about 1 to 5% of Zambians belong to R1b. It's a specific branch that breaks away from the main tree. So just to give away something I alluded to in the last episode, it looks like one of the echoes of the Huns who overthrew the Roman Empire in the first few centuries after Christ. you can see this R1b. I think it ends up here in North Africa and eventually in subsequent centuries spills down over here into sub-Saharan Africa. My point for this episode is you have men who look like this, who belong to R1b, whose origins trace the time of Christ in Central Asia to men who probably looked like this, not like this. And of course, Ken and I belong to that same branch. So all these three types of people are genealogically related in the last 2 millennia. And you would never guess that based on how we look today. Those are some of another shock that arises from the Y chromosome DNA-based tree, male inherited DNA. The sister branch of R1b is R1a. Nearly all the branches that we see today for R1a originated in the last few hundred years. This is a diagram from the book. If you can't read that, that says the major branching structure occurs and the separation of peoples occurs in the 1200s to 1600s. AD, just a few hundred years ago. R1b found heavily in Eastern Europe. I described that when I was talking about R1b in a previous episode, but notice it spills down over into Central Asia and India, all the way down into Sri Lanka. So once again, Icelanders, Norwegians, Swedes, Finns, all these guys belong to R1a, but so do some dark-skinned Indians. And those guys come from the same set of ancestors in terms of the Y chromosome just a few hundred years ago. Who would have guessed that? Many people in the mainstream community would connect India and Europe because of linguistics. They both, Europeans and Indians both speak Indo-European languages, at least many in India do. But they would say that connection happened thousands of years ago. And the split between the European and Indian groups happened thousands of years ago. And we have a genetic echo of that. I talk about it in chapter 8. But this is another event in history that connects these two ethnicities in the very recent past. Who would have guessed? In the episode we did on prehistory, so-called prehistory, the history of the Native Americans, I talked about them being part of this branch Q, and I alluded to this fact that there's historical connections between the settling of the Americas, several settlings of the Americas, and migrations into Europe, R1b being one of these that we just talked about and mentioned in previous episodes, from Central Asia. What that means practically, and I've tried to overlay the distribution of R1b and Q here, is the following. Let me make my point in a couple steps. So before Europeans arrived, it appears that Q was one of the dominant lineages in the Americas. Now, we've had a lot of migration from Europe. R1b, R1a are the dominant lineages in Europe that have now come to the United States. I haven't showed them in the Americas because I'm trying to look for the indigenous peoples. But I'm in the Americas. I'm R1b. Ken is in the Americas. R1b. There's lots of R1b and some R1a in the Americas. What that means is the Americas right now are filled with Central Asians. Both the Caucasian Americans and the Native Americans have Central Asian ancestry. They're more related to each other than I would be, based on my Y chromosome branch, to the ancient Romans. Another unexpected racial fact of today's populations. One more branch, N. I haven't really referred to it much at all in previous episodes. This is where it's found today, heavily across Siberia, Russia, into Eastern Europe. So this is the Sami people of Norway and Sweden, Finland, Scandinavia, Finnish people. Big circles up here, but lo and behold, it spills down over into Central Asia, India, Southeast Asia, China. So you think about the implications here. Many of these branches, again, originate in the last millennium or two. So you've got Eastern Europeans who had a common ancestor with people who look like this, Mongolians, Chinese, in the last 2 millennia. Yes, we have a common ancestor at Babel. We've also had many more common ancestors in the centuries, the millennia since then. One of the most shocking examples, and this will get us closer back to our original question about the 3 ladies, comes from the Pacific, Oceania, which encompasses both the Polynesians, lighter-skinned East Asian-looking peoples, and the Melanesians. And I'll show you some examples here real fast. If you look at modern Polynesians, like the Maori of New Zealand, Tahitians, you look at their facial features, skin tone, eye shape, hair color, hair type, there's a lot of resemblance to East Asians like the Chinese and the Koreans. No doubt about it. And genetically, they look like they did migrate from that part of the globe deep in the past, about 1000 BC. And I tell that narrative in chapter 11, I think, of the book. The Melanesians, like the Aborigines of Australia and the New Guineans, Papua New Guinea, that's part of Indonesia, they bear obvious, unmistakable resemblance to indigenous sub-Saharan Africans. Skin tone, hair type, hair color, nose shape, you just can't deny it. So if you were looking at physical appearances and you were asked, who did these people come from? Who did the Polynesians come from? Who did the Melanesians come from? You would be justified in saying, well, maybe the Polynesians came from sub-Saharan Africa, and the Melanesians came from sub-Saharan Africa, and the Polynesians migrated from East Asia. And in a sense, you'd be right. In another sense, you'd be terribly wrong. So I've already shown you here now, just to back up a slide. You might probably recognize that face from the slide of the three ladies. Yes, one of them that I showed was the Maori lady, but the answer you're about to hear may not be what you expected. The branch to which the Melanesians heavily belong is SKM. There's three of them here. They're grouped together because they're branched together. This is where the SK and M branches are found today. Again, you can see the largest circles found here in New Guinea, significant circles among the Aborigines of Australia. There's a large circle up here in the modern Philippines nation. There are people known as Negritos. They're dark-skinned people who look like sub-Saharan Africans, and they belong heavily to these branches. Those branches are on the completely other side of the tree from the dominant sub-Saharan African branch, the one that's dominant right now among dark-skinned African peoples and among many African Americans is E1B1A. This is, you can see just how abundant it is right there, all throughout Western Africa, Central Africa, and such. These are huge circles. About greater than 90% of Nigerians belong to E1B1A. Yet these guys come from Ham, and the Melanesians come from Shem. Their connection goes all the way back to the flood. They are not genealogically related in the sense that Africans migrated to New Guinea. They went their separate ways at Babel, not through Africa and into New Guinea. Group C, I talked about in the episode on the Native Americans. You can find some of that in the Americas. I've omitted that from this map right here, so we can focus on the old world distribution. You can look at the sub-branches within C, and I talk about this in the book, and map out the direction of the migration. About 1000 BC, something happened very quickly, migrated down through Japan, the Indonesian islands, over to India. There's some that also migrated down and apparently mixed with the Aborigines who arrived first, apparently. And then some migrated over here to the islands, the more distant islands of the Pacific. And also see here, the Maori belong to Group C. Easter Islanders belong to Group C. C is nestled here among the various branches. So A and B, you can see the maps in the book, but those are also sub-Saharan Africans. E2, E1A, E1B1B, African. C is on the side of the tree where all the Africans are. This is the dominant Polynesian branch. This is the dominant Melanesian branch. So counterintuitively, the Melanesians do not branch off the Africans. It's the Polynesians who deep in history did that. And then about 1000. So they branch off an African lineage, migrated up to Siberia, and then migrated down and through the Pacific. Who'd have thought that? People who look African in appearance, genetically, appear to have arisen outside of Africa, separated at Babel, didn't pass through Africa. Whereas the Polynesians, who look East Asian in their appearance, genetically look like they may have arisen within Africa. So what is the ethnic history, the racial history of these three ladies? Have they always looked this way? So I can tell you now that this lady on the left is an African. She belongs to the Khoisan peoples, or the Bushmen or the Click-speaking peoples of Southwest Africa. This lady belongs to the Afar people of Ethiopia. And as you've already seen, this lady right here is Maori, Pacific Islander. Well, the Pacific Islanders belong to group C, by and large. The Ethiopians belong heavily to this E1B1B branch. And again, these are ladies that don't have Y chromosomes, but I'm looking at the people groups to which they belong. And the Khoisan heavily belong to group A. Now, what does that mean for their history? Which of these three ladies shared a recent common ancestor? If you zoom in on the tree, I can't do it right here, but if you can see this in the book. The connection between A and E1B1B and A and C goes like this. You have to trace all A all the way back to here. And if you can't see the details, you just have to trust me on this, I guess. And then to get to E1B1B, then you follow the tree over this way. To go from A to C, you have to go all the way back here and over and up to C. In other words, the Khoisan lady, her people, are the same genetic distance from the African Afar lady and from the Maori. So it would be appropriate to draw the diagram like this. There is no hierarchy. You might think, oh, surely the two African peoples are more closely related. Based on the Y chromosome tree, they're the same distance apart. And perhaps that fits. This lady looks almost like a mixture of the two. She's got skin that's perhaps closer to her shade of brown, not as light as her, but her eyes much more clearly match the Maori's eyes than the Afar lady's eyes. The other features that make her African, but she's a mix of the two. So who would have predicted that? The Y chromosome tree rewrites common misconceptions about race and ethnicity. How can you use the term, oh, I'm white, I'm black, I'm Asian? Not only because we're all various shades of brown, but look at the so-called white people. Most of them are Central Asian in origin. Most of them had likely East Asian-looking ancestors just 1,000 years ago. We just looked at the history of the Pacific Islanders. The ones you thought might have been African in origin are not. The ones you thought were not African in origin probably are. And these are just some of the examples from the book. This is the wild new history of race and ethnicity that this sort of research uncovers. Again, you can find all this in this book, Traced. This is just a preview of some of what's in there, some of the research that's happened since our 2020 video series. It's organically connected to replacing Darwin. This is not a prerequisite in terms of reading for it, but there's predictions here fulfilled in Traced. The simpler version of this is Replacing Darwin Made Simple. And again, if you want to connect with me, answer some questions, perhaps after you get a DNA test or you're reading some of these books, I set up these social media accounts for that purpose.
Well, Dr. Jeanson, absolutely fascinating. And, it reminds us that, from generation to generation, changes can happen so quickly. I think because people have been so indoctrinated in evolutionary timescale that they get the idea these changes must be slow and so on. But actually, it's all happened very quickly. And the whole human race, we really haven't been around for that long. 6,000 years ago, God made Adam and Eve, and the flood about 4,500 years ago, approximately. And the whole of civilization that we have today, all the different cultures and so on, all fits into that biblical time frame and makes us realize we're all more closely related than we think we are. And a reminder that we're all one race. And those differences on the outside are so minor. You might have had ancestors who look much darker than you or much lighter than you or different eye shape to you, and yet you're closely related to them. And it's just really brings home the fact that, God made of one blood all nations to dwell on the face of the earth, and just fascinating information. So now in the final on this series, next week at 1:00, again, the same time, you're doing the final in this series, and you're going to deal with missions and scientific arguments for recent history. You're going to talk about, okay, we're going to be on the offense, not the defense, because we can take God's word as we should. And so that's going to be fascinating to see how you wind all this up and how you bring it all together for us. And again, the book Traced, and cutting edge research. Nobody else has ever done this before. And in this book too, the way in which you have all of these tables and charts in the middle. Just absolutely fascinating. And then people can do their own Y chromosome test and use your book and the information that you have to be able to find out who they go back to, and you might find a surprise. And I thought for sure that my lineage will be back to Japheth, but you show it's same as yours, back to Shem. It's just absolutely fascinating. So join us for part 5 of this series.